Bell Academy, as well as the head coach. So when we talk about the capitalism K versus critique Fs, it's important to note what exactly we're talking about. So for the purpose of this lecture, we'll discuss two main groups of critique Fs that a lot of the arguments will apply to, and a lot of the link arguments that we'll discuss will actually apply to both of them. Now, I think a lot of postmodern and post-structural theorists would disavow identity politics, and I think there are many identity politics folks who would disavow postmodernism and post-structuralism, but nonetheless there is a substantial overlap that exists between the two, especially in the way that Marxist critique goes about differentiating itself from them. Nonetheless, we will discuss both. So when we talk about a critical F or a critique F, what are we talking about? So for some of you who are newer to debate, a critique generally challenges the other side's assumptions, and in doing so kind of shifts the focus away from maybe a common understanding of the way that the world is and criticizes that and tries to shift it to a different way of viewing the world. So in that, critical theory stands apart from the existing world and asks questions like for whom and for what purpose. And a lot of postmodern and post-structuralist criticisms will have ideas and concepts that are considered contingent or not universal in their applications. We would discuss something that we would be called small t truths, as opposed to capital T truths that are considered metaphysical truths that could be more aptly characterized during the philosophical period known as modernism. These types of affirmatives may or may not have a plan. This lecture will be largely tailored to the ideas that permeate non-plan Fs, but on this specific CGR topic, I think a lot of these link arguments would also be successful against affirmatives that have plans that maintain some of the same knowledge claims and ideas that no plan Fs would normally have. So we're going to go through some quick vocabulary to start things off. We're going to discuss quickly, even though it was just 2 days ago, we're going to discuss capitalism, neoliberalism, and neoliberalism, things that we've already discussed. And then we'll move to modernism, postmodernism, structuralism, and post-structuralism. And the thought behind that is just to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of understanding the basic concepts. Now, if you'll remember from a few days ago, capitalism is an economic system, and it's largely characterized by the ownership of private property, a free market exchange. Remember, we discussed last time Adam Smith and the ideas of laissez-faire capitalism, where state removes control over the markets in order to let the market forces of supply and demand create equilibrium, and as well as kind of this idea of the free market and the indivisible hand that drives said markets. It's also belief in a rational actor model that people will generally work in their own self-interest. When we talk about neoliberalism, neoliberalism is not distinct from capitalism. It's definitely funny in a lot of debates when people read capitalism good against neoliberalism, there are these evidence floating around that's like neoliberalism is distinct from capitalism. Well, neoliberalism is more of a phase of capitalism, and neoliberalism attempts to explain that current phase of capitalism, which is capital mobility. And what that does is it challenges assumptions behind capitalism as an economic system, because neoliberalism uses that capital mobility in order to exert influence, in order to spread capitalism and open new markets through globalization, through trade, and through the exporting of capitalist ideas and values and like Giroux said in our last lecture, ideology, or the thought process that shapes the desirability of capitalism. So let's move to modernism. This is something we haven't discussed. We breezed through capitalism and neoliberalism, but modernism refers to the broad aesthetic movement in visual arts, music, literature, and drama and modernity. It refers to a set of philosophical and ethical ideas which provide the basis of the aesthetic aspect of modernism. Therefore, modernity is older than modernism. For the sake of simplicity, the authors use modernism for both terms. There had been a long debate among scholars on what exactly modernism starts and how to distinguish it between what modern is and what modern is not. When we discuss modernism in terms of philosophy, usually we discuss philosophies that have a metaphysical belief or a belief in absolute truths that are unquestionable and not contingent uh, and above the game board a priori truths. And so one of those would be that there is a physical reality, and that physical reality is something that we access. There can be definitive answers to broad questions, and there's less of a, even though there's a recognition of complexity and difference in terms of outcomes, that there is a certain understanding that we can know the world and know and understand our circumstances in the material reality. So postmodernism is a concept which appears in a wide variety of disciplines or areas of study. The same way we discussed kind of art and aesthetics. For modernism, it also includes postmodernism in art, music, film, literature, architecture, and technologies. And nowadays has burst into popular usage as a term for everything from rock music to whole cultural style and mood of society. When we discuss postmodernism, when it comes to philosophy, usually we're discussing kind of the break that is discussed between the ability for language to access and or represent reality. And that disconnect that exists between language or reality is thought to create such a chasm in which it prevents us from ever really accessing material reality. And if that is the case, if there is this, disconnect between the way we shape our language and the inability that exists within kind of the confines of language to access material reality, then our reality can be shaped entirely within the discursive realm. And if you're talking about more radical postmodernism, a lot of the times you're discussing the idea that reality exists entirely within discourse, and then some more moderate views would say that at minimum shapes the way that we experience the material reality. So here are some basic terms that would let you know when you're studying philosophy if the philosophy you are studying is a modern or postmodern one. So if you're discussing modernism, a lot of the times you see words like objective or rationalism or science, global claims, the best, generalizing, unification. For postmodernism, a lot of the times it's subjective or irrational, anti-scientific, populist, fragmented, non-linear, non-generalizing, concrete, and especially diversity. So, to further elaborate, postmodernism is preference and truth is a social construct to be eliminated. Truth and persons are given value only as the group values them. A commonality of postmodern views of international relations is an emphasis on how political action is affected by language, ideas, abstract concepts, and norms. So when we discuss that international relations, and political systems in general, that means that language, ideas, and abstract concepts and norms all affect the way that the legal system gets performed and is created in the first place. And so challenging those norms or challenging the language that shapes the way that our political institutions, in this year's topic specifically criminal justice, is formulated is helpful because it can change the way that we view those in order for it to change the way that it functions. So what does all of this have to do with politics? Well, one of the things about post-structuralism is oftentimes it notes about the lack of difference, and that can mean who are the actors that should be or should be recognized as performing politics, and those can be women, multinational corporations, countries that we generally don't talk about. And one thing it also focuses on is that states are not unitary and thus not necessarily rational. So when we talk about realist international theory, postmodernism and post-structuralism would criticize that, say that states are abstractions. And because they're abstractions and they're made up of a multiplicity of perspectives and motivations, then they can't always act in their own national interests because they don't have a shared interest. And also, it can be argued that the people, regardless of whether they're democratically elected, their interest that doesn't necessarily follow national interest. And so it kind of disrupts the idea of realist international relations from happening. One of the really important focuses of postmodernism and post-structuralism is the discussion of knowledge and power. And this is most prudently linked to Foucault and his kind of development of the way that knowledge, discourse, and knowledge are used to shape hierarchies. So for knowledge, it says that knowledge is not stable and eternal, as the history of science has shown us. It refers to probabilities rather than certainties, better than the best. And that the definition of power is limited most to tangible measures, not powers of ideas, norms, words, etc. But the idea that some people, experts, know more than other experts is not espoused. They believe the interaction between the knower and the non-knower is often best seen as a dialogue in which both are involved in an interactive process of knowledge creation. This kind of dialogue that it can exist within post-structuralism in order to learn from various perspectives as opposed to always defaulting to experts is something that can be useful and powerful. Here's just a funny joke I found online. It says, "Is someone you care about getting involved with post-structuralism?" As someone says, "My son has recently been using the term knowledge in the plural. Should I be worried?" And the other person on the other line says, "Unfortunately, this might be a symptom of reading Foucault. Refer to human nature in a conversation." Has he referred to human nature in a conversation? Or tells the person to refer to human nature in a conversation and observe your son's reaction. So when we talk about structuralism, oftentimes these postmodernism and post-structuralism and structuralism and modernism are used synonymously, but structuralism is known as an intellectual movement in France in the 50s and 60s that studied underlying structures, and post-structuralism offers a way of studying how knowledge is produced and critiques structuralist premises. It argues that because history and culture condition the study of underlying structures, both are subject to biases and misinterpretations. A post-structuralist approach argues to understand an object is necessary to study both the object itself and the systems of knowledge that produce it. So, while this definition of post-structuralism maybe focuses on systems of knowledge, postmodernism focuses on discourse, both of those things are necessary in order to create each other. And it's important to note that even though there are disagreements about whether it's postmodernism or post-structuralist, that it's generally referring to similar things. Okay, so What I want to quickly do is to talk through a couple of the different people that are relevant when we're talking about postmodern and post-structuralism. The first one is Michel Foucault. Some things to know about him is that he views language as the container of possible practices within a discourse. That speaking is not an innovative activity, but selection from a fixed set of practices governed by the rules that are permissible in language. Foucault, Foucault focused on the monopolization of knowledge as the source of power, and that monopolization of knowledge can only be disseminated based on, micropolitical action that seeks to reclaim knowledge creation. And one of the ways in which he would exercise that is by writing genealogies in his book that took different ideas like discipline and punish and showed that different ways of being have and what has been considered deviant behavior and punishable behavior has radically shifted, as well as the forms of discipline and punish throughout the years, or throughout hundreds of years. And while his history is often criticized by historians, um, the method of genealogy itself is something that's brilliant and shows that culture is not stagnant and that it's ever evolving, and kind of proves some of the postmodern and post-structuralist thoughts about contingency. The next is Jacques Derrida, which I think will come up on this topic, even though it has not been released anything by Camp yet. And for Derrida, the world is reduced to a text that must be interpreted. And his focus largely was on deconstruction and kind of challenging the explicit objective meaning of language. And he always, when talking, would kind of criticize everything that he was saying as he was saying it to just deconstruct that objective meaning and to show that language is always a process of becoming. But he did have political aspects that usually get talked about within debate, and one of his criticisms was of the death penalty, that there is this new international that could come forth with socialist ideas that combated rights abuses like the death penalty and could coalesce around that. So I do imagine that the death penalty will bring about a Derrida that will have this focus on language and focus on the text, but actually leave kind of an aporia or small gap within politics in order to find kind of a larger international possibility where things like the death penalty can be negated. Beaudry Art is one that has been more popular in debate. He definitely had a decade of being out of vogue, but has come back in. Beaudry Art has an interest in semiotics and signs and signifiers and the kind of the disconnect between the way that reality is presented and reality itself, and kind of goes a step farther in order to say that we're just at this point creating copies of copies when it comes to reality, and that we can't really any longer hope to access reality, and that capitalism reproduces those sorts of simulations and creates commodity fetishism that kind of drive desire for us to participate and own various aesthetic representations of what reality is supposed to be, all ending in kind of a hollow existence. Baudrillard was very much a negation theorist, not a hopeful one or an affirmationist. So that's another one. Obviously, Gilles Deleuze is another one, and one that has produced an affirmative at the camp. Deleuze says that there's differences that cause identity instead of identities that cause difference. Talked about transcendental imperialism and how experience produces new ways of thinking and challenges status quo knowledge. discussed Origami Cosmos, where experience continually changes or folds our understanding of being, and obviously, and of course, the aberracent versus rhizomatic thoughts that uh, focuses on the desirability of difference and being able to generate and create that difference of identity and individualism. And then Bataille, which comes out at camp nearly every year, discusses a base materialism, and he challenged a lot of our common understandings of causality and actuality. The thing that generally gets known for inside of debate is this idea of spending without reserve and not saving anything and kind of almost living in a hedonistic spending state. Um, and kind of attributed a value in luxury, but kind of at the spite of capitalism. Bataille is often used to either promote this idea of uh, at minimum spending, but then oftentimes kind of tries to link turn Marxist arguments by saying that without saving it, that it would kind of change the motivation for capitalist accumulation towards just expenditure without reserve. Um, he also challenges sovereignty, which he defines as life beyond utility, or the use of resources for non-productive ends. All right, we've now reached part 3 of our lecture, which is the capitalism critique versus the high theory arguments, which we've just summarized. What I wanted to start with was the 1NC link that came out from one of the senior labs as this Dean and 12 card. Now I've snipped out parts of it and put in some dots, so don't read this card as is from it. But I do want to kind of use it as a jumping off point to discuss how the CapK interacts with postmodern and post-structuralism criticisms. So this card says, some think that micropolitical activities, practices of self-cultivation are more important. This disconnect politics from organized struggle of working people making politics into what specters see. The left has eschewed such a goal, accepting liberal notions that goals are individual lifestyle choices. The left accommodated capital succumbing to the lures of individualism, competition, and privilege. And the absence of a common goal is the absence of a future. Equality distorted by a culture that celebrates the very rich, collective solidarity in redressing poverty and redistributing risks and rewards. So the crux of this is that this idea of radically individualized challenges, whether it be discursive or consciousness raising or individual understanding or reclaiming of various knowledge techniques or the understanding of a different way of knowing language, all kind of eschew the struggle of the working class because it puts alternatives into radically into the hands of the individual and also shifts the focus away from the community to the individual. And this kind of splinters people with a focus on difference. And this splintering kind of prevents the type of coalition building that would be necessary in order to find a common goal. For instance, when we're talking about the communist horizon of the proletariat in order to change capitalism and its derogatory effects. So basically leaving alternatives in the hand of the individuals and kind of promoting difference as opposed to similarities really prevents the commonality that would allow for a revolution to happen. One of the other, besides Dean, another one of the really popular authors who espouses or criticizes postmodernism and post-structuralism from a Marxist perspective would be Terry Eagleton. He talks about commodification, fetishizing, and libidinalizing. So I want to kind of discuss his the basic kind of line of his thought on this idea of culture, which oftentimes kind of lies at the heart of a lot of postmodern and post-structuralist writing. So Eagleton says that culture has existed as a critique of policy, government, and religion, and that within capitalism, culture becomes aestheticized, which then intensifies the importance of that culture, and it kind of hardens it and doesn't allow it to evolve or change. And then by kind of defining that culture, what the authentic culture is, it allows it to be commodified. And by commodifying it, it forces difference kind of as a signifier between that culture and other cultures, and creates market space and opens that market space to try and create that hardened, intensified version of the culture in order to promote it and sell it. And when that happens, where culture normally could serve as a function for critiquing policy, government, and religion, in this instance, it stops functioning as that critique, and the distance narrows between the culture and society. And because capitalism opens that space and promotes and sells that hardened culture, then it no longer stands in opposition to capitalism. It now benefits from capitalism, and is commodified and its value reduced to the monetary value that it's now being sold for. On top of this, this focus and promotion of various cultures and the intensification of culture can divide us because it focuses on our differences as opposed to focusing on our similarities as individuals, specifically members of the working class who have been disenfranchised by capitalism. And so he says that literature gave a deep consensus of values from the mid 20th century, and that literature has, right now ceases to be helpful. He also says that revolution was the most successful, uh, and now that culture has sought to divide rather than come together, that there's not as much of this attempt to kind of share what it is to be human and find commonality through humanity, and instead kind of, which would make revolution possible, instead focuses on different culture. So culture and politics have come together, and culture couldn't take the high ground and set itself aside. But now culture was now and is today what people are ready to kill or die for. And so that kind of promotion, intensification, and hardening of it can actually create conflicts that it was meant to originally criticize and prevent. Uh, First is kind of a question of interests. And most specifically focus on the individual versus the welfare of the collective. Postmodern and modernism and post-structuralism are generally hyper-individualistic philosophies that focus on the knowledge of the individual, the rights of the little r rights of the individual, and the inverse is that the freedom of the subject under capitalism is always the freedom that enhances the economic interests of the owners of the means of production. And so basically, with that focus on the individual, that there can always be something marketed and sold and market space created. That has a lot of overlap with the second link argument, which is identifies identities and culture based on difference. And this what what Marxism would call uh, kind of a preoccupation, a heavy preoccupation with this idea of difference, as opposed to focusing on similarities and commonalities, will only splinter the movement, especially in a country like the United States, where majoritarian politics is the method in which we can achieve democratic change, that becomes impossible if we continue to promote difference and stagnate cultures and intensify cultures and that focus on difference from kind of coming together in order to challenge capitalism. The third one is a hot topic, and this is kind of the rapid way that capitalism can squash dissent. You can have Che Guevara on your shirt, um, or be it something like even like the Black Lives Movement has been something that has been sold inside of stores and experienced market space. There were a few years ago, there was even a car commercial that kind of referenced some of the same talking points as the Black Lives Matter movement. And so kind of the way that capitalism is pervasive in order to always create new market space, regardless of the dissent, even if it's anti-capitalist in nature, is something unique about capitalism. Another one is horizontalism. This can be like an example of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So if there is a refusal to engage in conventional pragmatic politics, that can be in and of itself a link. So against a lot of planless affirmatives, you can use this idea of, boots on the ground, getting politics done, lobbying, knocking doors, etc., in order to create real physical change, as opposed to this idea of just abstract critique and kind of a divorce or refusal to engage with the government and policy proper. Another one is this misdiagnosis link, which we covered, and there was actually a question in the Q&A a few days ago. But whatever that source of the problem might be, if it isn't capitalism, if it isn't the root cause, then obviously it can allow the root cause to permeate and spread. So by misdiagnosing it, that means whatever the prescription is also is treating the wrong problem, and so cannot be viewed as valuable, and that we need to first be able to diagnose what the problem is. The other one is the commodification of identity and suffering. So this is similar to the hot topic argument, but focuses on specifically the experiential knowledge that exists in some disempowered communities, that academia has kind of this fetish for difference and suffering that can then be consumed and be made to feel better by bringing that to light, but never actually reconciling it, and especially never recognizing that there are strong economic forces that have caused those in the past, as opposed to kind of a hyper individual narrative that can somehow create the consciousness about that individualized problem in order to solve. And so that sort of academic commodification of identity and suffering is another general link argument. Okay, so now just in terms of strategy, we want to discuss alternatives and losing to the permutation. So the first one alternative that you can do are boring politics against a planless AF. If you do not want to lose to the permutation, then we can just engage in different forms of boring politics and engage the state. So if they're like, we can't engage the state in any way, shape, or form, then you know that if you say, well, our alternative should engage the state, then you can create the necessary competition. Sometimes this can generate artificial competition because it gives one more thing. You don't really need to win the desirability of state action or the desirability to engage the state in order to win your criticism, but it can create a clear point of difference in order to kind of fend off against the permutation. Another one is historical materialism. This engages in revolutionary social humanism that specifically sees dialectical materialism that we discussed in the last lecture, so I'm not going to rehash it in this one, as the correct form of history. So basically follow the money trail, focus on the economic forces behind the problems, and the kind of material aspect of it. Also use framing arguments to discuss the knowledge creation that permeates the link arguments and how any focus on difference can have an overall effect of the movement. I also want to state that one difference you can bring up in both the link and the alternative that isn't on the slide currently is this idea of materialism or material reality. So saying that reality exists within language, obviously hard, modernist perspectives of Marxism are going to heavily disagree with that and say that suffering is real, and that can be something that is very ethosy in order to say, suffering is substantive and material and people feel it, and to say it's reduced to questions of language, um, as opposed to kind of pragmatic, real reform that engages material reality can be seen as callous. And so keep in mind that that in and of itself can be a link argument and an alternative argument that focuses on the material reality area. Also, characterizing the debate as a method debate in your framing argument. You can set that up in cross-ex if there's a planless AF and you say, well, what is my ground? And they say, well, you can have a counter method, and you can say, well, if we provide a counter method, like, do you get permutations? Like, how do we compete? How does our method compete? And really focus on creating that difference that you can, that kind of can later in the debate help you versus the permutation. One of the other options you can do is you can approach this from a disadvantaged perspective. So you can read some sort of an alternative that says the revolution is coming, or you can just read a piece of uniqueness evidence that says the revolution is coming and we must act like it. And then you can kind of use your link arguments to prove that it would splinter the movement and prevent its efficacy from happening, and then read kind of just an impact card about how the movement will solve. And the advantage of this is maybe the other team is not up on their socialist movement's disadvantage, and it certainly gets rid of the permutation, but would not get rid of your ability to kind of solve the root cause of the affirmative. So reading it as a social movement's disad, maybe kind of transitioning from an alternative to the movement's disad in the block, could pay huge dividends and prevent them from being able to extend a permutation. Now, I wanted to discuss kind of the utility of impact arguments briefly. So it's easy to control the root cause, but not always necessary. So don't get bogged down. Sometimes inside of debates, that's just like I've seen debates about an anti-blackness affirmative where the entire debate kind of focused on this question of what the root cause of slavery was, whether it was race-based or whether it was capitalist-based, and what was missing was kind of what the ramification of who won this debate would be on the rest of the round, which clearly it can, but it also needs to be stated why that root cause argument is important. So make sure to do that work as well. You can also use your link arguments to turn the case or win that there's solvency defense against the case, because if you win your link arguments, then that can hurt. Then you can prove that hurts or destroys the efficacy of whatever the advocacy of the 1AC is. And so just like you would policy, like a cap K versus a policy AF, your link should serve as either defensive takeouts or offensive turns. Additionally, there's multiple potential values to life claims. Alienation, which we discussed in the last lecture, kind of commodification, where culture had been a weapon against the state. Now the intensification and commodification of that culture then becomes part of the capitalist system that then weaponizes it to prevent the revolution from happening. And then obviously the rich-poor disparity can also be a value to life claim. Now, the other thing that's important is you still want to kind of levy your external impact. So if you're fighting over who solves oppression better, that's a battle of internal links, but also accessing an external impact is something that's important. And obviously capitalism allows you to do that through through resource wars, as well as climate change, warming, or environmental devastation caused by capitalist externalities. And so we know that capitalism is crisis-ridden, and so creating those kind of external impacts is something that can be really strategic and important inside of a debate. Oftentimes negatives can get too focused on just who wins, that they solve oppression better, when if you have that sort of a competition, that easy tiebreaker can be this external impact. Now I wanted to cover a couple of the specific links for a few of the authors. The first would be Beaudry Art. The Beaudry Art specific links could be the symbolic versus materialism that we just finished referencing. You could also discuss consumption versus production focus in terms of what is the whether it be the consuming, which is Beaudry Art, or focus on the means of production, which would again link to materialism. And then also the politics struggle versus discursive. Beaudry Art obviously locates everything within the realm of discourse and representation, while political struggle needs to be in material reality. For Bataille, there's the apology and the chimera of capitalism. So already imbued with gift-giving, move to postmodern consumerist economy that ignores production and utility. Also peacemaker with capitalism, Bataille embraces capitalism for its contradictions and relies on hyper-individuality to challenge it, instead of kind of the focus on the commonalities that would allow for the revolution to happen. So maybe destroying capitalism and its ideas for one individual might be great, but it's definitely not a method to overthrow capitalism overall. Also, consumption as aesthetics is obviously problematic and very capitalist, as well as the plenitude of resources, which is definitely a bourgeois perspective, and not one that is, not a philosophy that's accessible by any means of the proletariat, because you can't really spend without reserve if you do not have the resources to spend in the first place. For Deleuze, we have the nail. One of my favorite in the file that has come out is the nail in 13 evidence. It says that Deleuze poses a new danger, that the pure affirmation of difference will be ultimately ambivalent. It may merely reproduce a complicity with the process of capitalist deterritorialization, that affirming the potentiality of transformation as such is to affirm a purely ideological radicality that inevitably changes over its opposite. Once the mass festivals of democracy and discourse are over, things may make place for modernist restoration of other among workers and bosses. If the multitude is a form of being that can give birth to ambivalence, the affirmation of this ambivalence as a political commitment remains radically insufficient. With no clear political consistency to organize or motivate any particular political transformation, they remain ambivalent towards revolutionary politics. And so within that is that just this ultra focus on difference will create ambivalence when it comes to the communal necessity for Marxism in order to thrive. So revolutionary politics can't kind of exist within that pure affirmation of difference, because it focuses entirely on difference as opposed to commonality. Now, shifting from Deleuze to some of our more specifically identity-focused affirmatives, one would be queerness. This Jackson evidence kind of discusses what one of the link arguments might look like against an affirmative like this. It says, explanations of global queering confirmed contention that capitalism has played a central role. Market processes have been more important in the proliferation of queer cultures and identities. Early global queering studies imagined as a site of persistent pre-capitalist tradition and male homosexuality represented as a domain of transgressive, Western-influenced, commodified modernity. Meaning that at one time queerness stood in resistance to capitalism, but now that space has been opened. And what the piece of evidence goes on to say later is it discusses how that has been commodified through that opening of spaces, and how that now identity kind of reinforces that exact same argument of difference that prevents mass revolt against capitalism from happening and kind of reinforces capitalism because there is more of a celebrated market space that has come into existence. For race-based affirmatives, some of the links that are discussed are first, identity splinters collectivity, because we live in a majoritarian democracy. That's one that we've already discussed. Second is this idea of expanding the market space, that identity recognition means integration into that system, and that the market finds the way. Within that too is this idea that the desire, the end focus of many race-based affirmatives may be a decrease in the barriers to access rich money and wealth inside of the United States. So getting rid of those barriers might be kind of the neoliberal focus of race-based affirmatives. And additionally, the diagnosis link, which we've discussed in prior places. Here I want to discuss this Adolf Reed in 19 evidence. It says the cornerstone of race ideology, which never has been incompatible with capitalism, is presumption of ontological difference among populations apportioned into racial groups. It masks a class-skewed agenda. Egalitarian politics is entirely consistent with neoliberalism's inequality and why their de facto alliance with corporate Democrats has been automatic and untroubling. Slavery was a labor relation, not an extreme system of race relations. Its objective was to produce cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice. Its appeal to the planter class was that it secured a labor force that has no rights or recourse. And so this kind of discusses some of the root cause arguments in relation to slavery, but says that this focus on race is compatible with capitalism, and its presumption of ontological difference apportioned into racial groups prevents that class skewed agenda from being able to be actualized. Adolf Reed is one of the primary critics of race-based approaches to overall systemic oppression, and sees the class as a unifying factor, not that race doesn't exist or that racism doesn't exist outside of capitalism, but that focus and that coming together is what we need in order to solve the problem. So before we move on to the Reed evidence, before we move on to discussion of settler colonialism, we have a short video of Adolf Reed discussing this perspective of why a class focus is more important at this time in history.
I mean, do you think there are ever issues where you just have to say, well, I mean, is it ever possible to mobilize around something that is not in the self-interest of I mean, we don't want to always have to appeal to self-interest. There are things where we're going to have to pursue things where people are going to have to give something up.
Well, look, I mean, my take on this is that, so like I read Aesop's Fables a lot when I was a little kid. And my favorite one, well, one of my favorite ones, was the one about the contest between the wind and the sun. They were boasting back and forth at each other, and they determined to test their prowess against a wayfarer who was walking along the road, and whichever one could get him to take his coat off would be the more powerful. So the wind blew and blew and blew, and no matter how much harder the wind blew, the traveler just kind of pulled his coat more and more tightly around himself. And then when the sun took its turn, right, it just sort of began to radiate more and more warmth. And the traveler eventually took the coat off on his own. My approach to politics, and this goes back to the question of what counts as a movement and what doesn't, is the project of trying to fasten a broad-based political alliance in which different people and constituencies can not only see a vehicle for pursuing their own interests, but can come to understand that a condition for advancement of their own interests is equal commitment to advancement of their partner's interests, right? So from that perspective, and like this also connects with one of the sort of standard, almost pro forma beefs that I have about what's called identity politics, which is that I just don't understand. I've said this for more than 30 years too, how we build solidarity by going around the room to stress how profoundly we actually differ from one another.
Does that mean that the black-white wealth gap is sort of inevitable then, or is there something that can address that particular?
Well, yeah, and that's a good question too. I just saw a recent study by a guy named Alaprantis and his colleagues that argues in a seemingly persuasive way that actually the root of the wealth gap is fundamentally the income gap, right? And what's interesting about that is that well, in the first place, like the argument seems plausible, although I'm having difficulty reconstructing it in my head off the top of my head now. But they purport to show through experiments that if you close the income gap substantially, right, like at any given point, then the wealth gap that would take 500 years to close can be closed in like 30, right? Now the Alaprantis study has been met with, I wouldn't say a firestorm because there are no weapons, right, for the firestorm, but circumspection because, for predictable reasons. One of them is that people who study the wealth gap are committed to the wealth gap being causally meaningful. So like, and just as academics, but I mean also, there's an embedded ideological vision that's sort of smuggled into the wealth gap construct, right? Like in this sense, what's the big penalty that comes from the wealth gap, right? The big penalty comes from limits of capital formation, right? And rich black people talk about this all the time. Well, okay, so then what would capital formation do? Well, capital or more repaired access to capital, right, comports with a political ideal of strict equality, real equality of opportunity being like the fundamental norm of social justice, right? And it's like this difference that my good friend Preston Smith has harped on for a while now. There's a difference between the principles of a racial democracy and the principles of social democracy that existed in a state of de facto tension, right, in black politics from the 30s through the 60s and 70s. And I think kind of what we have here is like a conflict between two different ideals of social justice and two different ideals of social justice for black people, right? I mean, one of which hinges on overcoming unjust impediments to upward mobility within American neoliberal capitalism, and the other of which is, frankly, socialist.
I want to talk to.
So, as Reed suggests in his video, class consciousness, the recognition of majoritarian politics is the prerequisite in order to institute change, and the focus on commonalities are all kind of the sunshine that can get someone to take off their jacket as opposed to blowing the wind against them in order to force them to do that in terms of the fable that he used. And And then at the very end, he discussed kind of what the end goal might be, where many race-based consciousness approaches would be to get rid of impediments to social mobility um, for Black communities, which would be neoliberal in general, or a socialist focus, which would obviously be his preference and the only way that he could see that they could successfully have both emancipation, specifically for Black folks as well. Now we'll move to settler colonialism. The file has this great piece of evidence by Bandar. It says that the forging of a new field of settler colonial system studies risks creating binaries between studies of colonialism and settler colonialism. That colonial dispossession traveled throughout the networks of trade established during the British Empire. Tools include land appropriation, extraction, erasure of negative legal systems. That post-colonial capitalism denotes ways of understanding capitalism's dispossession that profit form and reinforce class hierarchies, patriarchal formations, racist ideologies. These terms do not neatly fit into the settler colonial framework. Forcing them into a single category risks losing this richness and undermining forms of political solidarity across spaces. We believe that our futures are connected. We are powerful when we enact solidarity. To expect solidarity, we must be willing to give it, share it, and maintain it. To do otherwise is to risk producing solidarity on the very colonial terms that our movements seek to challenge and undo. So basically stresses that class is a unifier and that there are other forms of oppression that do not neatly fit within settler colonialism, and that forcing everything within settler colonialism creates unnecessary binaries that can splinter the movement and allow for capitalism to continue to succeed. There's a second piece of evidence, this Weber 16 evidence, that I think is very good. It says that short of massive transformation in the political economy, any efforts to rebuild indigenous nations will remain parasitic on capitalism. Transformation requires networks beyond indigenous movements struggling against globalized capital, including labor, women's, trans, queer, and environmental movements. An anti-capitalist strategy of indigenous liberation requires broad networks of solidarity and purposeful linkages, meaning that it can't be just settler colonialist focus, that it has to reach out to all oppressed groups and focus on class. Otherwise, any form of transformation and any form of liberation that did occur would leave indigenous folks in a parasitic formulation on capitalism itself. And so this alternative needs to extend and create coalition across broad movements as opposed to only focusing on the oppression unique to settler colonialism. So the last thing that I want to discuss today are alternatives when it comes to some of identity-focused apps. One is class collectivism. And Adolf Reed writes about this, supplemented by bell hooks, but this is a focus on similarities over difference. And so in terms of, your framing can be who can create the mass mobilization in order to solve oppression. And you can focus on class collectivism and broad-based social movements based on the unifying factor of class oppression. And those two pieces of evidence in conjunction with each other can be a powerful comparison between the two. Another one can be historical materialism, kind of re-examining history not through a lens of the identity proposed in the 1AC, but through historical materialism or an economic focus that you can win as a superior form of education and knowing. Obviously, versus AFs that embrace different forms of pessimism, that boring politics and work towards bettering of society is something that can generate competition. And then lastly, the post-identity politics alternatives like Butler or Brown can also criticize identity focused based on difference because it can destroy commonality. And so kind of a universalization of difference that can be unifying. And so that's Judith Butler and Wendy Brown, which also are very great on that subject. So in conclusion, thank you for coming to the lecture. Look forward to the question and answer period. Capitalism, I think, can be a great criticism against critique Fs, just as long as you're cognizant that the weakness will be the permutation, and you go through steps of getting as specific of links as possible that can guard against that permutation, setting up your framing arguments in order to create explicit competition in method v method debates, as well as winning that your alternative is more desirable than the permutation itself, and that there can also be strict points of confrontation between that. And I think that class consciousness and the knowledge creation that goes behind that can stand in stark difference with either post-structuralist or identity-focused debates. Anyway, thank you for listening. Again, this is Josh Clark. I coach at Montgomery Bell Academy. Please feel free to email me if you're not able to come to the question and answer period. Thank you.